The Lord's Prayer in Luke starts, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. When you read these great manuscripts, here's what you have. Father, let your name be hallowed. Let your kingdom come. Give us today our daily bread. Well, what happened to all the other stuff? See? Well, the two prayers have become, I don't know what you say, accommodated to each other in those later manuscripts, in those ones that seek to kind of smooth out the difficulties. It's not just because they're later. They're from a tradition that seeks to smooth out the difficulties, whereas these manuscripts are the kind that seek to preserve the difficulties and to preserve the, what would you say, problems in the text and so on. And sometimes it's just a really small thing, like Galatians 6:17. Now this is really interesting. Why? In Galatians 6:17, it's this simple thing. Finally, let no one furnish me difficulty, for I bear the stigmata, the marks of Jesus in my body. Right? Now, that's what these stricter manuscripts do, the marks of Jesus. But there's a whole bunch of manuscripts, including the King James ones, who expand upon that and will say then, I bear the marks of Jesus Christ, or of the Lord Jesus. In fact, that's what the King James has. Of the Lord Jesus, or of Jesus our Lord. In other words, kind of putting in extra verbiage that is almost liturgical or something like that. So this is the kind of thing that you find. Now, let me just kind of summarize on that last point. So in a sense, this is sort of the cheap, quick, dirty, and nuclear version of what I'm talking about. It seems like what happened in the transmission of the text of the New Testament is that there was a tradition of being kind of strict copyists. Generally, those are associated around Alexandria, and these two, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, are two of the best proponents of that. Then there's this loosey-goosey kind of version, like Manuscript D, which contains extra stuff, like the saying about Jesus and the guy on the Sabbath. Oh, here's another good one. In chapter 12, when Peter is released from prison, it says that the gates swung open, and he went down 9 steps. Well, I mean, that's probably right, but it's probably not what Luke wrote. It's the only manuscript that has that. But D gives you a bunch of extra stuff like that. And then there's sort of the elegant version. The one that, is kind of consonant with the liturgy, that incorporates as many things as possible and doesn't omit stuff. And that's more or less what you have with the text of the Byzantine tradition and the kind that Erasmus used. So now we move to point 3. Impact on English translations. The King James, when you look at an English translation, there are 2 kinds of translations, and you have to consider what you want. Okay? There is the King James tradition, which essentially rests on the Erasmian Novum Instrumentum text, though it's been modified in later years. But the modifications, now listen to how I'm going to say this. The modifications in later years seek to maintain the verbal cadences of the King James. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. See, it's not, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing at all, or something like that. You know, it keeps the cadences. Now, look what I've got there. I've got a list for you. King James was revised principally in 1881 in the so-called RV, or Revised Version. That was the one in England. In America, it was called the American Standard Version of 1901. In 1952 came the RSV, and many of you probably remember the RSV. I was about 7 years old. I'll never forget when it came in. I was so disappointed because each verse was not a separate paragraph. They did the paragraphs all like you read, something like that. Boy, did that bum me out. Now, this was the communist Pinko version, okay? Because there were about 7 places where the RSV took decisions in the translation that went against the King James and seemed to be against a high Christology and a high view of the Bible, like translating Isaiah 7:14 as a young woman, you know, rather than a virgin. Or in Romans 9:5, the way they punctuate it doesn't make Jesus God, and so on like that. In 1972 came the New King James. Now, the New King James is sort of an update of the Old King James. It's not the RSV. It's the update of the King James, taking out the these and thous kind of thing. But do not be deceived. Do not be deceived. It did make some textual changes on the basis of these better manuscripts. And they don't always tell you when they do this. So I just warn people about this. The New King James is way more like the King James than the RSV. But it's not just the old King James with these and thous taken out. They futzed around with it a little bit. Then comes the famous ESV at the turn of the millennium, the English Standard Version. Now, I was part of the team for this. They had this translation team, and then they picked a bunch of scholars, about 50 of us, to vet the translation and to give our comments and so on, and I worked on Acts and 1 Peter. I was kind of disappointed in that almost none of my suggestions were taken. All right? However, I will tell you this, I did get one suggestion in there which makes it different than all other translations, and that is, in Paul at Athens in Acts 17, where he's talking to the people, and he says, you know, I noticed as I was coming that you are very religious. Then I saw this altar to, and almost all translations say, to an unknown God. But I said, no, the Greek construction without the articles is normally used in formal statements. So that should be to the unknown God. And they changed it. So the unknown God in the ESV is attributable to James W. Voelz. But I told them at various points that they should make these various changes, and they said, we don't want to do that. So, but I'm a big proponent of the ESV for this reason. Now, listen how I'm going to say this. This is important, Pastor. This is important. The ESV stands in the linguistic tradition of the King James, which means that the older members, like me, who grew up with the King James and then the RSV, keep the cadences. All right? The Psalms sound sort of the same. When we get to the next group on there, it's not like that at all. And this is why I try to lobby our synod not to use the NIV for catechism. Why? NIV has some real advantages, but here's its big disadvantage. It has abandoned the linguistic tradition of the KJV, which the parents and grandparents of the confirmands know. And you should keep that trend, that kind of trend, translation tradition. It's what I call creeping obsolescence. So the translation's always a little bit stilted. Why? Because you're kind of keeping contact with that thing in the past, but you're trying to move forward to make it more, you don't use the these and thous and so on like that. Now, next point. The non-KJV translations. And the biggie here is the New English Bible of 1962. In the NEB, they deliberately broke from the linguistic cadences and language tradition of the King James. They were, of course, also using these, what I would call, stricter manuscript tradition. Then you have the TEV, the Good News for Modern Man Bible of 1966, which sought to write its thing at about a 4th grade level. So it was doing this, and it also had another linguistic idea. The NASB of 1971 is probably the most accurate translation of all of them, but it's clunky linguistically. It's clunky. It doesn't work for public reading very well. The NIV came along in 1973 and 78. Unfortunately, in 2001, they produced the politically correct version. So if you get an older one, you're better off. There's The Message of Eugene Peterson in 2003, and there are some other ones. Some of you are familiar with the NET, the New Evangelical Translation, which is actually very good. The Berkeley edition, and then there are these paraphrases like the Phillips paraphrase from the 60s and the Living Bible. What are these paraphrases like Phillips and the Living Bible? I'll tell you what they are. They're Manuscript D. Not that they're following Manuscript D, but it's the same idea. I'm going to expand on the language and tell you more and kind of make it more plain. So Manuscript D is like a paraphrase in that sense. Now I'm going to end with your point number 4, choosing a translation and the W.L. Wonderly chart. Now this guy who worked for translation committees came up with this incredible diagram. And he said, this is the range of linguistic usage that is possible. There's kind of a sharp line here because all linguistic usage below this line is unacceptable to people using standard English. Everything above this sort of wavy line is not accessible to people without higher education. All right? So here, this is like saying he don't never do this know-how. And up here, we are talking about variegated possibilities. All right? So his point was, from here up is fine with the educated, everything from here down is accessible by people with limited education. And now look at the chart. The crosshatch area, Pastor, is where communication takes place for the general populace. When you speak, you cannot be so highbrow you are inaccessible and so lowbrow you turn people off. You gotta have the crosshatch area as your goal. And ladies and gentlemen, that's where the NIV aims. And it's exactly why the NIV has remained a popular translation, even though it is a highly suspect translation, because it takes weird decisions linguistically on stuff. And I could give you examples. But I'm not talking about that right now. I'm not talking about accuracy. I'm talking about accessibility and acceptability. So currently then, you'd put the NIV right here. The old KJV is up here. When it talks about the superfluity of naughtiness in James, which means excessive naughtiness, of something being worthless, excessive worthlessness, superfluity of naughtiness, people don't understand what that is. So that's inaccessible up here. If you're doing the cotton patch version of the New Testament, that's down here. So now, where are our versions essentially distributed? Well, RSV is kind of right here, and ESV would be something like this. Good News for Modern Man's down toward this line. So that's the TEV, today's English version here. I would put something like the NASB as just about to cross the line because it's pretty formal about stuff. But my chart here shows you, I think, two things, or the Wonderly chart. One, you have to be concerned about accuracy, but two, you have to be concerned about communication. So, which Bible should you buy? Which translation? I think you need two of them. I think you need one that will kind of take you into the verbal system and so on, like the NASB does. But reading it out loud is kind of a disaster. So if you're going to read something in public, then the NIV is really good, even though it's very suspect at some places in terms of accuracy. Frankly, if you have to pick one, I think you're best off with the ESV or RSV. If you can only have one Bible, it's the ESV or the RSV. Because it does everything at least A-. Okay? It preserves the linguistic tradition of the King James. It has used the better, more strict manuscripts as its basis. And it is accurate substantially in its translation. So I think the problem I have with the NIV is I don't think it's got enough connection to the language of the King James, which I think is quite important. Okay, listen, I know it's like drinking from a fire hose, okay? I understand that. You guys have been a great audience. You really have been. Are there any quick questions here before we... Yes, sir.
Where does the Catholic Bible fit in?
The Catholic Bible is kind of its own tradition because the Douay Rheims version, which was done at about the time of the King James, or a little bit before, always had to take into account Jerome's Vulgate, the Latin. See, that's the trouble, is they work with Greek manuscripts, but they have to be careful in their tradition because the Latin's kind of the official one. So it's sort of its own thing in a way, which is why something like that, or the there's an AV, the American version. They've never caught on outside the Catholic Church because it's kind of a different manuscript tradition. Good. Yeah.
Someone had put me here today asked me to ask you about, she wants to know if you explain the Leviticus scrolls.
Oh, the Leviticus scrolls. Yeah, well, you're probably talking about some of the stuff that they've discovered with the Hebrew text that goes back even further than Qumran. But you're going to have to invite me back so we can talk about the Old Testament. And that's its own thing in itself. But listen, thank you very much, folks. I've really enjoyed it.